A couple quick stats leading into this. So anti-corruption related, 33% of companies are highly confident that they're able to catch employee violations of anti-bribery and corruption laws. So that's not very high, which means a lot of people are very uncertain. 84% of world's most ethical companies track reports and related investigations regardless of reporting channel. So in the beginning of the day, we talked about all the reports coming to managers. A lot of the WME companies have figured out how to codify that. Bella Member Hub resources, so companies like ADM, AECOM, Bayer have all provided really excellent resources. Encourage you to check it out. So with that, I'll hand it over to Saqib to introduce the next panel.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel session today on cross-jurisdictional anti-corruption and effective investigations practice. This is a topic that divides opinion and is quite hard to get right, much like the kiwi smoothie that was served at lunch earlier. Today we will discuss some of the challenges that come with implementing anti-corruption compliance policies globally and carrying out investigations across various geographies. At the end of the session, we will talk about some of the emerging trends that we're seeing in the compliance space and move a little away from anti-corruption in that discussion. So my name is Saqib Alam, and I am an off-counsel in Morrison and Foerster. We call ourselves MoFo. MoFo is a global law firm that has been in London since the 1980s. And at MoFo, my team and I specialize on cross-border compliance investigations and dealing with regulators around the world, typically with a US and European nexus, although the conduct that we typically investigate and look into takes place in the far corners of the world. Today, I am your moderator, and there's a very good reason for that. I have never worked outside of government or law firm, and the real expertise from the business side lies in our panel today. And I'm going to let each panelist introduce themselves, going alphabetically, starting with Femi.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Femi Thomas. I work at Nokia as the head of business integrity. That is a part of the compliance organization that's primarily responsible for risk assessments and investigations. I've been with the company now 3 years, and I think most people know Nokia but do not know what we actually do. So if you're thinking we make phones, you're in the group of people who don't know what we do, which is most people, including some people who work for us.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Gareth John. I'm European Director of Legal Affairs at Sodexo. Some of you might have heard of Sodexo. We're a French facilities management company. I'm a member of the Ethics and Compliance Committee at Sodexo. I've been there about 10 years. And I'm also chair of the Sodexo Stop Hunger Foundation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Zimmerman. I lead the investigations team for control risks in Europe and Africa. Control Risks is a global risk consultancy doing everything from security advice through to political risk analysis and investigations and compliance.
Hello everyone, my name is Lisette van Enenaam. I'm not expecting anyone to pronounce that last name correctly. Just call me Lisette. I have been with ABB for almost a decade and now I'm their Chief Integrity Officer. Have a background, I did a bit of a wrong way around. I studied law and then I stumbled into corporate investigations and consultancy. Worked for Control Risk for a couple of years when I was really young. And kind of moved on from there. So I have about 15 years of experience in investigations. And now I'm heading the investigations team amongst other teams within the integrity department in ABB.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Let's start the discussion with what drives anti-corruption compliance. And more recently, because of the increased levels of enforcement action for anti-corruption behavior by both the US and global authorities, companies have been driven towards anti-corruption compliance because of the risk of regulatory enforcement action. But increasingly, we're seeing reputational risks coming into the fore and impacting companies' compliance posture. In this age of leaks and trial by social media and investigative journalism, companies can face severe and long-term repercussions for anti-corruption and compliance violations. My first question is for Femi. How important is reputational risk in driving anti-corruption and compliant behavior?
Thanks. It's increasingly important, of course. It's a topic that's often discussed. We see it, we feel it, we talk about it in our various industries, in our businesses. But if you think about whether it has the same sort of impact or driving force as a compliance area of focus as, say, when you talk about risk exposure to FCPA issues, for example, probably not. Because when we look at those charts that outline the largest FCPA fines over time, they resonate with people, it makes sense, the risk is apparent. When we think about reputational harm issues, they're difficult to quantify. And so they're often very difficult to reconcile in a business conversation, though people tend to, they recognize it, but it's hard to reconcile. But of course, the impacts are very diverse and very present, share price impacts, loss of ability to attract new talent, loss of existing talent, brand value, and so on and so forth. So in our organization, what we try to do is ensure that our risk assessment or our risk management processes properly account for reputational harm. So we do a cultural cohesion tracker every year. It's a survey basically that goes out to all of the employees. And in addition to asking questions about the core compliance areas, we address issues around reputational harm. That, of course, requires you to really understand the end-to-end business cycles, so including your procurement, your manufacturing, and so on, so you can ask the right questions. You then have to make sure that your case intake or management process also accounts for reputational harm issues. I've seen many programs where you are able to report on improper payments, conflicts of interest, bribes, and so on and so forth, but they ignore some of these other, you might call them softer areas, softer issues. And then I think some of the other things that we do that help with that are making sure that our investigative processes have the right capabilities for these different types of issues, including using a matter escalation matrix, which allows you to say, I'm categorizing cases not just because it's a bribe payment, but because of other risks that it may pose to the organization, even if it's not a regulatory issue. And that, in turn, invites some important considerations around notifications and leading into your crisis management tools. So who needs to be notified when a certain issue happens, how does that happen, and how quickly it needs to happen. So I think these are the sorts of areas that I think are helpful for managing thoughts around reputational risk and harm.
Thank you. And Michael, because there can be immeasurable harm from reputational risk, does this mean that anti-corruption concerns are getting more management attention?
Well, if I think back, say, 15 years or so, when I started, clients would come to us to ask us to investigate, largely for financial loss. Their concern was about recovering money. And over the last decade, the focus has been much more on regulatory-driven investigations, fears of fines and penalties, and so on. Increasingly, over the last 2 years, I think reputation issues have really come to the fore, and that's due to the changing level of stakeholder pressure, which you referred to in your opening remarks. One interesting thing that we've noticed is oftentimes if a company announces a regulatory investigation, the share price will fall, but it recovers relatively quickly. Whereas we've seen some companies that have had damage to their brand or damage to perception of the ethics of the company, that can be a much more profound and long-lasting issue for them. So then there's no doubt that management take those issues seriously. I think what varies from company to company is how quickly they respond and how they respond. And what we often see is that the response can be too late and it can become a crisis. And then the behavior is more designed towards protecting the company and advocating the position rather than looking at why did this thing happen in the first place and what can we do to stop it happening again. So I think there's definitely management attention there. Whether it can be galvanized to drive integrity is probably what varies from company to company.
And what is the role of the compliance officer in all this? Are you seeing them working even closely with management as a result?
Well, I think the discussion in the last session was really interesting because I think what different companies see compliance as, and where does the compliance officer fit within the kind of sphere of ethics and integrity there's a huge variety, and we're seeing more organizations move away from compliance being the responsibility of compliance, and particularly in these kind of what I would call board level issues, existential issues for the company. You've got the C-suite involved, you have general counsel involved, you have compliance, but you should have the business involved. And it's about, I think, how does that unit within the business that holds responsibility for integrity, how do they use these new issues as a platform to have more influence in the organization?
Great. And Lizette, other than this carrot stick approach, are there any internal drivers of compliance that you've seen?
Yeah, I think so. I think one thing that's really important, and next to what the gentlemen have already said, is the people side of it. What I see, and I've been an investigator for a long time, and I've traveled the world and done investigations in places of the world where you wouldn't even want to come if you were paid, because it's harsh circumstances. And so for some of our employees, whether you are purposely involved in wrongdoing because you want to gain from it personally, or whether you are put in a situation where circumstances are putting you in a place where you have to adhere, or you feel that you have no other option than to be part of a scheme, that is hugely stressful for people. And I think what you see with, inherently, I believe everybody wants to basically work in a happy, safe, ethical work environment. Most people don't need that additional stress of being short on resources, having to do a million things at the same time, and then also the stress of potentially getting caught on something. So I think in that sense, if there is an opportunity and the company delivers the right tools and circumstances and wording and culture to make sure that they can do the right thing, they don't have to go through that stress because they can report things. They can say no to a senior manager who says, you take a piece of the cut because then you're part of the scheme. Is something that counts a lot. And I think when you're in your headquarters or in your ivory compliance tower or whatever, you need to be very conscious of the fact that people need to be able to reach you. And that if they reach you, and if they come to your whistleblower hotline, or if they come through a different channel, that you send someone. That they see that if they mention something, if they have a concern about something, that a few weeks down the line, somebody shows up from the company that will investigate, that will talk to you, that will listen to you. And I think that is really one of the biggest, changes and drivers of compliance. Well, we call it integrity. We've heard in the last panel as well, having ethics, having integrity is more important than being compliant. I think that's really a people thing.
Can I just add to that? I totally agree, and it's just a general point about attracting and retaining good people. People want to work for good, clean companies, right? Yeah. And so that's just it's a basic part of the business case. You're going to attract and retain really good people if you're good at this stuff, and there's you avoid the cost and the time management of recruitment and all the churn, etc. So I think that's really important.
Great. So moving from driving compliance to delivering compliance, how do you reach out to people across countries, languages, cultures, and time zones? Gareth, sorry.
Right.
What practical issues have you faced as you've implemented your company's compliance policies around the world?
So a bit of context. Sodexo, it's a French company, and in France they passed a new law a couple of years ago, Sapin 2, around, you probably know it, anti-corruption and good governance in corporations. So that was in response to the US kind of reaching out and fining French companies. So it's a good example of taking back control, to coin a phrase. So there's this new law, the regulator, the AFA, has got teeth, and it's out there auditing French companies. And so that's prompted a refresh, shall we say, of our global compliance program in that area. So that's the context. And so we're midway through this program. Let me start with global versus local. It's a classic kind of conundrum, isn't it? But there are local differences in law and in culture. But in Paris, we want to give a coherent picture to the regulator when they come knocking, okay? And avoid kind of like a proliferation of different local policies and practices. I know it's a basic point, but just getting the good governance in place, so having a central repository of your global policy and your global training, so you roll it out and you can localize and translate. Really good, consistent governance setup across all of the countries globally. So we have an ethics committee, country, region, global. You've got legal, you've got CEO, you've got HR, you've got internal audit, you've got supply chain, business rep. And just making it easier for people to get started because people are at a different part of the journey in countries, so just a good basic quarterly reporting template, incident, investigation, findings, remedial action, closeout, and just doing that consistently, just starting in that good place is really important for a program. That's what we've discovered. A second thing I want to pick up on, and one of my colleagues from Sodexo is here actually, is involved in the whistleblowing facility, obviously an important part, legal requirement to get that right. And what we've discovered is that the local differences in law and culture, in some countries it's counterculture, they're kind of snitching on your colleagues, historical reasons for that. And I always think of the Netherlands in terms of consultation with workers' representatives, so we've got a global service provider and with the facility to opt in, but we just have to be really sensitive to navigate each of those country issues in a way which respects the culture. That was a major finding. The last one I think I'd say is just the importance of excellent communication and training program top down. This is why it's important to the company. This is what you need to do in terms of policies and process. And by the way, here's some really good online training that explains it all. And you have to do it, and we're tracking it, right, for the audit trail for the regulator. That's been really, really important part of implementing the program. Very last thing, the value of legal having really strong relationships with HR, internal audit, supply chain business. I mean, that's really helped cross-border to get a consistent approach with the program.
And Lizette, your company has 150,000 employees around the world. How do you test whether your compliance framework is functioning, and particularly for something that is so large and constantly evolving?
It's not easy. It's not easy. The amount of employees is one thing, then being present in over 100 countries around the world, and being we're in technology, engineering, so we are in high-risk countries and we're in high-risk industries. So it's incredibly difficult to do a catch-all, and I do think that we're seeing a change now. We're seeing from the early days when 2005, 2006, when the first real broader compliance programs in the bigger companies started to emerge. And we've had an anti-bribery and corruption policy since 1996 or 1998. I was blown away when I saw that, and I said, give me that policy, and nobody actually had a copy anymore. Because probably nobody really cared too much at the time. And I think the story of that is that you need to keep driving it. You need to keep evolving with the time of what is possible, what kind of tools do you have out there to support that communication. Now, I'm not going to repeat everything that Gareth said, because I agree, you need to really have your policies in place and your processes in place and make sure that everybody sticks to that, and that there's kind of the golden rule of how we do things in our company. I think developing and making, you see it in your results. I mean, we have a whistleblower hotline that is very broadly used. And so, somebody in the audience said, how do you deal with the peaks? And I thought, I wish I had peaks, because it means you always you have lower times as well when there's more rest. But unfortunately, that isn't the case. I think the good thing is that it's being used broadly means that there's a sense in the organization that people come forward and feel comfortable to come forward. And that's really, for me, a finger on the pulse to see, okay, how is the organization doing? So I measure it a lot by looking at my investigative statistics. And when you see more serious cases come up in certain areas, you need to go in and understand why things have happened. Because you can have your program, you can have your culture, and you can have done all your trainings, and everybody is like, oh, ABB, great, you know, we're working for an ethical company. And then all of a sudden, boom, it hits somewhere. And you would have never expected it, and it's, you know, it's very disappointing that something serious can happen nowadays after all the efforts and all the money we've put into it. And I think when you see those kinds of cases, you really need to, as a chief integrity officer, you need to go in and you need to talk to the people yourselves. So, you know, I travel to these countries where these bigger issues are, and I talk to the people, and sometimes I get involved in the interviews because I want to understand, you know, what is the root cause? Why does this happen at current day and age in our company? And what do I need to do to remediate it? So it's a constant driver of understanding the development in your organizations, the development on the people side, and the development on your side of how can I catch things and how can I prevent things.
And quick follow-up question.
Sure.
High-risk industry, you're all over the world. How do you determine what the right standard is for anti-corruption compliance for a program that's going to be applied all around the world?
My personal opinion is you have one standard, which is zero tolerance. People come to me and say, well, you know, here in Indonesia, we do things differently. No, you don't if you're working for ABB. You don't. So the consequence is that we won't get certain business in those areas where there is a higher risk. But you also need to be willing to talk to your business and say, hey, if you're starting this big new project, you're doing this tender in this high-risk country, high-risk industry, and they'll call us in because we've got a very direct line with the business presidents to talk to them about the risky projects that they want to get involved in. And you have to offer other opportunities to still win that tender in the right way. And I'm not saying, you know, you can't give them a suitcase full of money, but you can give them a Mercedes. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying is you're working with your business to give the best offer possible to the client and to make sure that you win on quality and on knowledge and making sure that you interact with the right people in your customer's organization and not just one-on-one somewhere where deals can be made. So the setting needs to be incredibly transparent. And if you're pushing that and you're coming in and not only the customer knows, but you know the government involved knows and the surrounding villages know because they'll have work for it. If you come in and you show yourself as a potential person or potential company for that tender, certain expectations are raised of, you know, what kind of company is going to do this. And then you bring in the best technical specifications, and you bring in the best knowledge, and you promise certain maintenance, and you promise making sure that the services and the products are going to stand for the next 10 to 20 years. Then all of a sudden, if that project goes to, you know, an unknown company from a certain area in the world that suddenly wins that tender, that's going to raise questions, and that's going to raise questions with a lot of different entities. And you may still lose it, but you know, maybe next time around you'll win it. And you have to keep pushing that communication, and you have to try and influence the local customers and the local governments to do the right thing and pick the best quality.
So you have these third parties, you have these employees all around the world, and this was a topic that was touched on very briefly this morning. Can you incentivize compliant behavior? There's one school of thought that says you should not be incentivized for doing the right thing. And then there's another school of thought that says if you reward and show appreciation, it does not necessarily have to be financial remuneration or financial incentives, then you will encourage your employees and your third parties to prioritize compliance. Gareth, how do you create a culture of compliance, and can you incentivize compliant behavior?
Well, certainly I agree that, you know, doing your job in a compliant way, that's a baseline expectation of your employees, right? It's a fundamental requirement for working here, right? But at the same time, I think in reality, companies do compliance in some areas better than others. So as leaders, I think we need to encourage, continuous improvement in whichever area of compliance that we're talking about, for all the reasons that have been discussed earlier: reputation, fines, etc. The speaker who was on before, was it Jermaine, who was talking about rules-based versus behaviours and principles? I think that's really important, because if it's about culture change, it's about changing people. The parallel I've got is health and safety. So the world I'm in, catering, facilities management, we do tracking of LTI, which is lost time injury rates. People will be familiar with that, and there's an LTR rate. A few years ago, we weren't in a good place on that. And it was just relentless communication and focus top down on this, and measuring it in tables and targets, which got us to a really good place now without being complacent. So that relentless communication does, if you're persistent, create change and really good change. Another parallel actually is at the start of every meeting we have a safety moment on health and safety, right? So it's in the DNA, in the fabric of the company. And I use that as a parallel as well, because there's no reason why we can't have a compliance moment or an ethic moment or a data moment, whatever area of compliance is real for your organization right now. But it's that connection with people which will drive the cultural change. So what's the phrase? People might remember what you say, they'll recall what you do, but they will absolutely never forget how you make them feel. And there's been some really good safety moments. There's a video with one of our workers down in Brazil, and without his knowledge, interviewed his partner and his children about how important it was that the husband and dad would come home safe at the end of the day. And at the end of the video, those interviews were played back to our member of staff, and wow, was that impactful. Lots of tears. But it really connected with people here. Now, finding ways to do that on something that's in the head around like ethics and everything, that's a challenge for us, I think. But in terms of driving cultural change, connecting there, that's where the gold is, I think.
Femi, any follow-up comments? What's happening in your organization?
Sure, a couple of things. First, those points really resonate with me, Gareth, because I came to Nokia from the oil and gas industry, and we now do safety moments at Nokia as well as compliance moments. I think for a long time, compliance officers have been saying, I want a seat at the table. But one of the things that we do wrong is we then try to come into the room with our own table. And by that I mean, for all of the things, the initiatives that we have, we're trying to introduce a new burden on the system. And we've got to find opportunities to bolt on, to take something the business is already doing and try to exploit that to our advantage. And so the safety moment, again, is one example. Many companies that take safety records very seriously because of their industries will have morning meetings where you have the opportunity to get a 3-minute compliance message in. So we do that as far as trying to get to localize the compliance message and get it across. And on the point about incentivizing compliance, I think incentive programs are not necessarily designed just because of trying to reward an employee for doing something you think they should have done. Instead, it's an opportunity for advocacy. It's an opportunity to have a discussion, because now I've got that employee in that far-flung country who has received this award and can have a discussion with others about it. I will point out that it is not without risk. So you might do 100 awards, which are great, and if you make one wrong one, where you've given an award to the employee who everybody in that office knows is the bad guy, or you've promoted an employee into a leadership role who's had compliance misses that the organization didn't catch but that the peers know, you wipe out the value of the 100 you give out.
Well, before we move to data and technology and investigations, I'm going to open up the floor to some questions. Does anyone have any questions on what we've discussed so far? Right at the back.
Yeah, hi there, James Kindon from College International. We're a property consultancy. I just wanted to pick up on something that's been talked about by this panel and by other panels during the day, which is culture, and just ask the panel their thoughts. I've worked in different industries and come across the culture excuse, reason repeatedly. But actually, something that some of the panelists, I think Lizette, you mentioned this, is that 99% of the world's population want to do an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. And even in places where culture is bad, nominally, they know it's wrong because nobody ever asks for a bribe out in the open. So people inherently know, even if they don't know exactly what the FCPA says or the Bribery Act says, people know right from wrong. All over the world, they know right from wrong. And so I just wanted to pick up on the culture discussion point and see, me personally, I've kind of moved past culture as a reason and an excuse. And I say to people from Kazakhstan or from Russia or from the Democratic Republic of Congo, you know it's wrong. So to say that it's the culture, I just wanted to know if you have any thoughts on the kind of the individual knowledge of right and wrong globally versus this kind of herd mentality that says, oh, this is just the way things are done here. But even if it's the way things are done here, it's never done out in the open, so you know it's wrong anyway. Do you know what I mean? So I just wanted to ask if there are any kind of opinions on the individual versus that kind of cultural reason or excuse for bad behavior in different countries.
Michael, do you want to take that and add some follow-up comments?
Okay. So I agree with you at the high-level point that I don't think you can kind of identify countries in the world and say, here, generally, people think bribery is okay. I think, in fact, if you go to those countries, most people are sick and tired of it and probably have a stronger view than maybe in other countries. I think what does change is maybe the way you need to articulate or help people understand what you're looking for in the behavior might need to change. So if you're saying, my vision is for the organization to be good, everyone would agree with you, but there are countries where giving a piece of work to your brother might be seen actually not as a bad thing to do, but a very sensible thing to do, because it means you can trust the quality and you know the delivery. Or if I have to pay a bribe to get my kid into school and I have to pay a bribe to not be stopped by the police, then if I come to you in the office and say, we need to get this shipment done, maybe it's hard for me to know what you're asking me. So I think the articulation of what the organization believes good means, and the kind of examples that are given to help people understand what you see that to be might need to vary. But I agree with you. I don't think there's a cultural justification by geography. Just on the other point around incentives, just to be slightly provocative, I was going to say you can either have incentives aligned to your compliance message or they're not. So I think this question about should you have incentives at all which promote compliance, the alternative is that, as Femi was saying, you promote someone who's known to be non-compliant, or you give a bonus to someone who's made the most sales in the year. And this misalignment between incentives and the message the communication you're setting out on compliance, I think, can be really, really slow down the adoption of a good compliance culture.
Did you have a follow-up comment to that?
Yeah, I think, nowadays, and in some of the other questions to come, we're going to talk a bit about, using artificial intelligence and analytics and more of the tools that today are there to help us in our investigations. I think that development is fantastic, and I myself very involved in it to kind of develop that internally in ABB as well. But I think what we're talking about now is also incredibly important, and equally important is the human side of things. And as we're becoming more digitalized and have more and more tools and more data to look at, there's things that are very important as to your question from a cultural perspective. Yes, the line is, it's not a thin line, it's quite a broad line, because for some people in their countries, in their day-to-day stuff, as you said, if you are an expat in India and you want to get your internet connection connected in your home, you're going to have to pay a little facilitation payment to get it done, otherwise it's never going to happen. You're going to be Wi-Fi-less forever. And, how do you kind of align that with zero tolerance of your company? And I think it's not easy, and I do think you're right. People know intrinsically right from wrong. What are the really big ticket items? Bribing for a big project. And if it's zero tolerance, it's zero tolerance. But you need to also understand what what people understand and how they translate it in their day-to-day work. And I think there's a big job for professionals like all of us here in the room, is if we are not able and capable to go to those local organizations, to go to those people that work, our colleagues that work for us in remote places, and translate what we mean by zero tolerance and what we expect from the behavior from our employees, if we cannot translate that and help them translate that in their day-to-day work, you cannot expect them to be perfect. And so, you know, do things drop off a little bit on the left and on the right? Yes, of course. If you have hundreds of thousands of employees, yes. And they're not going to call you every day at headquarters and say, hey, I'm here in a sandbox in Saudi, and you know, guess what? The customer wants me to take him out to dinner in an inappropriate place. What am I going to do? That doesn't happen. But what you do is give them tools and handrails and guardrails to understand, okay, customer wants to go to dinner. I know there's a gifts and entertainment database. I need to go in and kind of mention that because he's a government official. I just call my manager, and that also helps them to come back and say, listen, I can take you to dinner, not a problem, but let me take you to this restaurant instead. So you kind of need to do that translation and help them and give them the right tools in order to find that cultural balance of right and wrong, which is not a black and white thing.
Great. We've got 15 minutes left, so let's move to data and technology and its impact on compliance. I think we're all going to agree that technology plays a big part in what we do, and technological advancements have allowed whistleblower platforms to protect the anonymity of whistleblowers. And we've also had technology facilitate training modules that have been rolled out across our companies. But at the same time, we're dealing with a lot more data. We've got WhatsApp. Someone mentioned Yammer a little earlier. We've got Slack, non-email data, non-paper data. And that has complicated the investigations landscape in more recent times. Michael, very briefly, how has this landscape changed, and how are you helping your clients tackle this?
So from an investigation perspective, we see three kind of key changes, which are all fairly obvious, but have a huge impact. The first is there's so much more data, and it's kind of a commonly accepted stat that you've got kind of 80-90% of all the data ever created is in the last few years, which means it's harder to find what you want, and there's more to look through. And then you have the pressure from the regulators that their expectation is that you'll preserve everything that's potentially relevant, and you may not know what that is, and organizations may not even know where the data sits, which leads to the second point, which is there's now a much greater variety of data. So everyone thinks about data in systems, but you have loads more systems. Going back in time, the systems changed. The systems don't talk to each other across the organization. The systems vary by country. Somebody somewhere will have their own little Excel spreadsheet that they use to keep it because they don't like the system. You'll have hard copy documents. And so you have to kind of navigate this complex landscape. And then the third, which I think is kind of maybe the most important, going back to I guess the theme of this panel, which is data is actually about people, is that you have to understand how users use the tools they have. Because, for example, maybe 10 years ago, email was the tool of communication, and then it was Messenger, and now it's WhatsApp. Well, if you don't know in the particular country or the organization how people communicate, you're not going to find the system that has the data that you need. And even then, you have to unlock it. So you need to know passwords, you need to know encryption. And I guess finally, on top of those three things, which is about the change in the data landscape, you have issues of data privacy and regulation. There are some countries where we have to get signed permission to image people's data, like Russia. There are countries which won't allow us to take data out, so you have to analyze it in country, like Russia. Not just Russia, though. And then there are issues with personal data, personal phones, what's the company policy. So, I mean, from an investigation perspective, there's a huge amount now of planning and understanding to even get to the point where you have data to look at.
I think that's right, and we've recently seen a relaxation in DOJ guidance in relation to personal devices. About 2 years ago, there was a policy statement that suggested that there should be an outright prohibition on using personal devices for work-related matters, and since March this year, the DOJ has relaxed that and has now encouraged companies to adopt their own policies when it comes to personal devices. And Femi, and not only because you're in the device business, not anymore, what is Nokia doing for BYO device policies in the company?
Sure. So BYOD is obviously a risk area because whereas before you had control over the devices, you had access to the data, you now have a potentially unlimited number of extraneous devices that work off the company network. And of course, issues, as Michael said, with accessibility to that data. So we approach it a couple ways. For every employee who has their own device connected to the network, they're required to sign on to our network use policy. Network use policy has certain very specific prohibitions in it. The device also downloads a software that allows us to do a limited amount of monitoring and remote wiping where necessary for data protection issues. But I think equally important is how we're addressing communications over social media and other platforms. And that, of course, continues to be very tricky. Many companies have struggled with that. We have taken the position that we focus on business records, and we're asking people to not make business decisions by WhatsApp. You can't have, or we do not think at this time that we can have a total ban. I don't think that's feasible or practical, given how widespread the use is. So we are encouraging our business leaders to make sure that business decisions do not occur on WhatsApp. That should move into an email or somewhere else. We're monitoring the development of these platforms that might in the future be more suitable for the enterprise environment. We're actually in touch with some developers in that regard. And then as far as Yammer and Jabber go, which we also use, we push out messaging. So for example, when you open up our Jabber screen, the very first thing that comes up is a notice to you about the appropriate uses of Jabber. These are not 100% fail-safes, right? So these are steps that we're taking that we think can help mitigate the risk, but it's a developing area and it's still in flux.
Great, and on that point, any questions from the audience in relation to BYO devices and personal devices in the workplace? Okay, great. Well, we've got a couple of minutes left, and I want to turn to the emerging areas of compliance and move away from anti-corruption compliance in this part of the session. We're all in different businesses, so we face different issues. And data privacy and protection of minors are on the tech companies' agendas right now. National security, sanctions, export controls. Just now over lunch, I was having a conversation with someone about national security issues facing a software company. So we are seeing the compliance landscape changing, and I want to go do a quick round with everyone here on the panel on what is increasingly creeping up on their agenda. And let's start with Femi, because you and I discussed the US-China trade war and that having an impact on your business as well.
Sure. So China's always been important for us. We have a large presence in China, a few JVs and over 20,000 employees there. Of course, in our space, two of our biggest competitors have had very public issues concerning sanctions and China this year, and the third now recently disclosing other significant issues involving, in part, China. And so it's been very high on our radar. We've spent all of this year looking at our compliance program in China. And so you're right, a lot more of my time is being spent not only on sanctions issues and making sure that we're in good shape there, but looking at how our presence in China may be impacted not only by heightened US enforcement activity, but you must realize that if there is heightened US enforcement activity, then conversely there will be heightened Chinese enforcement activity across many different areas. For example, we talked about moving documents outside of countries, state secrets reviews required in China. And so you've got to be very careful to make sure that while you're focusing on sanctions activity from the outside, your domestic operations in China are also in good shape. So we've been very, very busy making sure that the compliance program takes a 360-degree view of the commercial activities we have between China and other countries.
Great. And speaking of political change, Gareth, you're in the food business, you work for a French company, and I have to ask you about Brexit risk and whether that has landed on your desk. Alongside that, anything else?
Oh, Brexit, the B word. Yeah, like most people in this room, I'm sure I'm part of a task force and we've done all the contingency planning, so we're in a good space there. But it's related, yeah, labour. So we're a people business. We've got 500,000 staff worldwide. We've got 35,000 in this region, UK and Ireland. So people and, Brexit, of course, that's going to be a squeeze on a certain profile of the workforce. We're a very operational company as well, so that's bound to have an impact. So you have to plan around contingencies for that. But more generally, labour abuses. We've got a big supply chain. I think of the Modern Slavery Act. We're only ever as strong as the weakest link in the chain. So we just got to continue to be really sensitive to the supply chain at all parts of it, in terms of the due diligence and the vendor checks, etc. So I see that as an issue for us. Big company. I think the other thing also, digitization. So you can't escape digitization, right? So, we work in universities and students, and, there's technology now where you can look at the consumer preferences, what kind of shot they want with their coffee, and that population is very discerning in terms of nutrition and the provenance of your food. We want to touch that consumer all points of their journey through university, and so obviously the way in which you harvest that data, you've got to do it in a legitimate way, and you've got to hold it securely. So I just see digitization around the delivery of food services is becoming more and more common, and so we've got to be really sharp on data.
Michael, are you seeing anything? Quick comment?
I think Lizette's got something better to say.
No pressure.
And if I may add, Lizette, because we spoke about it as well,
Yeah.
alongside new areas, are you also seeing existing compliance risks evolving in a certain way, and are they expanding into a different form?
Yes, I think for companies like ABB, where we're always using a lot of third parties, that keeps developing. So you close down intermediaries, pop up the agents. You close down the agents, pop up the distributor schemes. You close down that door, and hop, there's another third party somebody thinks of that there is a way to kind of manage things through third parties. And we are very, very strict in our training about that, about what you cannot do direct, you cannot do indirect, and that's something that we keep preaching. I think, Nicola, you said it when you were up here. It's third parties is basically expanding. It's not just your third party local agent anymore, your subcontractor or your vendor. It's basically anyone you deal with that's not an employee, and that includes customers. So we also have a program where it's called high-risk business partners. So basically, I'd like to call third party just business partners. They're all business partners, whether they're customers or vendors. And in high-risk areas, we do the same level of due diligence on our customers to see whether it's sound to sell to them. And I think this very much coincides with what Femi says about tracking your trade compliance and your trade sanctions as well. So that is something that keeps developing. And yes, we all have our systems where we have the due diligence and we answer the questions and this and that. But something that I'm really seeing is we need to keep pushing substance over form when you're working with your third parties and you're assessing and managing your risks. Because you can have all the internal controls in the world and nobody's able to get a penny out of your company. So we're really good, we've done all that. And then, there's new schemes that keep popping up. And there's always a small percentage of people in your company that shouldn't be in your company because they just have the wrong idea of what, how business should be done. And they will always try to use third parties to get something done. So third parties and business partners management, risk management is one of my main jobs during the day. And then at night I worry about them.
Great. So we're at the bottom of the hour, so that's time, but I'll open up the floor for 2 questions. Does anyone have questions for the panelists?
Yeah, okay. Sinead Hall from Eton. And Lisette, just to follow up on your point with the high-risk third-party management, something that we're struggling with as well. And in those countries where we were talking about perhaps where corruption is more customary or prevalent, we've been thinking about how do we set the expectations for those third parties, including our customers from the very beginning. How do we have those early conversations that mean they don't then come and approach you for a bribe or a backhander when you're halfway through the public procurement process. So I wonder if you're doing any particular training or communications to your high-risk third parties at the moment as part of your program.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's been discussed a couple of times today. One thing is very important to include in your compliance program is integrity on the business agenda. So what we do is we give information and stories to share, and we stay out of the room. You know, we don't have to be integrity in the room every single meeting, but we encourage and we talk to our business leaders to say, okay, when you have a management meeting about a big new sale or this and that, why don't you start off the meeting with, you know, a chit-chat on integrity and the risks and the concerns, and maybe combine it with safety and security, where, you know, that's always a nice combination because it kind of flows into each other. And so we give them the tools and the stories, and we train them, of course, face-to-face training, e-learnings, whatever you can do. And we also do very targeted training, so making sure that the salespeople in the business get specific trainings and specific awareness. And you need to keep raising that awareness. Now, is it always perfect? No, absolutely not. But you know, you keep seeing, okay, we need to move on this, or we need to move on that, and you will see, you know, there's a lot of change suddenly. This project, this country, you see a lot of gifts and entertainment requests popping up. Now that's a precursor for me that something's going to happen on a tender to come. So immediately then we go in and we make sure we talk to the business. We say, you're responsible as a business manager for what's going to happen in that project. Now, if I catch this project doing anything that is off the charts, I'm going to hold you personally responsible for it. And that makes sure that, you know, that business manager is like, yeah, I'd rather not have another meeting with you and just do the right thing. That's how people sometimes respond to me in the company.
We had one last question right here in the front row.
Svatava Sprague, Microsoft. There was an interesting point made at the very beginning of your conversation about obviously the appreciation for people who are raising concern and the need to get back to them, make them feel that, you know, something's happened after they did the right thing and raised their hand. And so I was just wondering what were your thoughts about, and what are your approaches to, what do you do to circle back to the people who escalate, the whistleblowers, so to speak, and how are you balancing the confidentiality issues, sensitivity surrounding investigations with the need to let them know that you've done the right thing?
I have 2 sentences.
Okay, all right.
You go first.
Do you want to go?
Sure. So a couple of things. So first, we place a lot of importance on how long it takes to get back to a whistleblower, to a reporter. I prefer to use the concern raiser. And so we have a triage every day. In the UK, it's 9 p.m. In the US, it's about 4 p.m. That allows us to respond to every concern raiser within 24 hours of when they raise a concern. And then we also place a lot of importance on the feedback loop to the reporter. So every single matter requires a closing conversation with the reporter. Of course, there could be many over the course of the investigation, but at the end, a matter cannot be closed without some evidence in the file that you've provided feedback to the reporter. Regarding what that feedback is, we don't have enough time, but we have a 6+1 rule of the 6 things that must be said. and the +1 is a statement about retaliation, which only comes up if there is some sense that that might be an issue. But we do have some guidance for our investigators on what, at minimum, must be said to the reporter.
That's it.
Quick follow-up question on that point. So your 24-hour response is presumably very brief and saying we're looking into this and then...
Yeah, so within 24 hours, the assigned investigator has to make contact with the reporter either by email, usually by email, and say, I've been assigned to the matter, I'd like to arrange some time to speak with you. Now, the time to speak may be days away, but they need to make contact within 24 hours.
Yeah, we have that same instant response. We're just 24 hours slower, so we have a 48-hour rule. I think one thing is important to give that kind of feedback, make sure that each and every reporter gets a feedback and gets to know that their report is being heard and that somebody's taking care of them and that they have someone, a person to connect to after that first report. I think that's important. The other thing you were saying is more about how do you deal with, should you praise people? And so we have a part of your bonus scheme in ABB is integrity is part of it. So you need to be able to show for some kind of integrity support or something that you've done throughout the year in order to get your bonus points on that. And that needs to be checked with your manager. As much as I need to make an effort to do something for a customer while I'm not in sales or marketing or whatever. So people are kind of looking for what can they do in those areas where they're actually not working in to also support those values. I think when it comes to appreciating whistleblowers, I think it's very difficult, next to what Femi said. If there's a couple of people that love to be center stage in front of the newspaper, like reporter, me, yeah, cool. But actually there's a lot of people that are not that confident. And so, you give one a pat on the back. What about the hundreds that were very brave to report things, and even anonymously, and they're never getting the recognition for it because actually they're too scared to get recognition for it? So in the more important cases, what I do is I just call them up myself and just show them, I know you're in China, in a factory somewhere. If I always need to check if they speak English because my Chinese is a bit rusty. But give them the personal recognition from someone they'd never expect a call from, and say, you know what, I've been monitoring this case. You reporting it had been incredibly important for the company, and I just want to thank you. And that comes back to what Gareth says. It's about how you make them feel, right? It's not about a picture on the inside website. It's about just giving them a thank you and saying, that was a very brave thing of you to do.
And just to add to that and close things off, that's the point that's resonated all day today about the personal touch that compliance officers have, particularly to people who report misconduct, and indeed when they're spreading the message, the compliance message, to the far corners of the world. With that, I want to thank the panel for this fascinating discussion and all of you for tuning in. Thank you very much.